This is internationally best-selling indie author Michael Brent Collings inviting you to join me at bestsellerlife.com/DCR to unlock my tips, tricks, and hacks for a successful writing career. So go to bestsellerlife.com/DCR and kickstart your writing adventure today.
This is Daniel.
And this is Krebs.
This is Alton.
And I am Matai.
And you're listening to Dungeon Crawlers Radio, the greatest geek podcast out there. All right, everyone, welcome to another exciting episode of Dungeon Crawlers Radio, where it's me and Alton talking about some great stuff, very gaming related, tabletop games, stuff like that. We'll be having fun having our discussion. Yes, Matai and Krebs are not with us at this time, but that's okay. They're off doing their own amazing, wonderful adventures. Sometimes the party must be split and then come back at a later date. Yes.
It's true.
Yes. All right. So do we want to run with your topic first and then we'll dive into mine?
Well, Dan, it's just I've been known to game from time to time.
Yes.
I know this is new information. You're just learning for the first time. And Dungeon Crawler, who's joining us, I'm sorry that I've never before revealed that I love role-playing games.
Yeah. And you've never revealed that, just like Krebs has never revealed his love for Kroll.
It's true. It's true. But you know what? We all get to learn new things about each other. And one of the things that I've been learning recently about some of the players that I've been putting through is that their idea of what a good, or at least a satisfactory gaming session is very different than the nearly 2 decades at this point of playing and GMing that, well, I guess not quite nearly 2 decades, but the long time that I've been GMing at this point. My definition of what's going to make a good session or not is very different from theirs. I'm very theater of the mind. I'm very role play oriented. I want to see my characters grow. I want to see the story progress. But for these players, it can sometimes be very different. And as this was going on, I then got contacted by another friend who actually wants to come run a session for me. Now, I'm really excited about that because I don't get to be a player very often. But as he's asking about what my setup is and what he needs to bring, it turns out that his definition of the bare minimum to make a role-playing game happen is even a higher standard than what I've encountered with any of my players up until this point. And so I thought it would be interesting to hear, based on our subjective opinions, what it takes and what we've seen. So to give an example, there's this most recent player that I was talking about who's planning on coming to run this game for me. He was very clear that he needs lights set up properly. He needs music in the background. We've actually gone through and we created a bit of a custom mix to be able to run a not Cyberpunk. Brain's not working. What is the
Shadowrun?
Nope. Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, yeah.
Yeah, so we found the background music, but then there wasn't quite enough rain, and so we had a whole other set of speakers set up just to handle the background rain, right? Everything needed to be painted. Everything needed to be just right. For him, the show is the experience. And although the storytelling is another vital part of it, he doesn't even want to sit down at a table unless everything is looking and feeling just right. That ambiance is everything to him. So Dan, the first question I have for you is, for you, knowing this is completely your opinion, what are like the bare minimums for you to have a good time at a gaming table?
I mean, I'm definitely not to the level of your friend. Character sheets, dice, maybe a game map that you can draw on. Mm-hmm. Really, that's it. If people have books, if people have figurines or miniatures, excuse me, that's fine. I mean, I've ran it with pennies, or coins signifying, the pennies are the goblins, the nickels are bugbears, stuff like that, or even glass beads. Miniatures are awesome, don't get me wrong, but I don't care. I don't care if they're painted. I don't care if they are. Really, a lot of it kind of similar to you is a lot of it's theater of the mind. The only reason I have that is for good referencing to help the players kind of understand, if there is anything blocking an arrow from hitting a target or anything like that. But I don't need that. Because I'm very old school. We didn't have all these, these doodads. There were not figurines. There were not walls and dungeon tiles and stuff like that. And, more often than not, if there was, scenery or buildings, you normally saw that at like a game store. And it wasn't something you could buy. It was something they had on hand there. And normally it was for like 40K or Warhammer or something like that. And so there wasn't a lot of that. And so a lot of it was in my head. Then they came out with those really cool play mats, that were either hexagonal or squared, and you could start, wet erase markers on those. That helped build stuff, but that's kind of how I've always ran. It is great when I have beyond that, because then it really adds and levels up the game. But wow, to have that as your bare minimum, I'm not even sitting at the table unless I have that. That's rough. Like, and I all props to that individual for doing that. But if that's the bare minimum, that's my mind, my opinion. And if, please don't take any offense to any of our listeners or anyone else. How many opportunities of amazing gameplay are you missing out on because you have such a high bar to always have to start at?
See, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I want to actually advocate for him for a moment.
Sure.
Because I've been sitting and breaking this down in my head over the last so many weeks since I had this conversation with him, and going, okay, so what drives that desire, right? And you mentioned 40K. I think that's a big part of it. Accessibility to people to create terrain and maps and dungeons. It's more accessible than it's ever been, especially with the advent of 3D printing. If you are treating this as, your main hobby, there are a lot of resources now to be able to do really cool and creative things that would have been exceptionally difficult to do back in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s.
Yeah.
Right. But the other part that I considered with him specifically is that he, very similar to me, lives in a world of gaming, but he doesn't get a lot of chances to actually sit down and play. It's something that he has to set time for far in advance, and sometimes even give up work opportunities to be able to sit down at a table and be with other players. Now, I know that he attends conventions and things like that, and so I doubt that he holds that same standard when he's going to go out to a convention. But for somebody who maybe only gets to sit down with a group, once a month, once every couple of months, maybe, I can see some expectations there that says, if I'm going to block off an entire evening, pay for a babysitter, make sure that, everything's taken care of, I want that experience to be as good as it can possibly be. And I have to admit, the Blade Runner that I got to play with him was absolutely phenomenal in terms of its atmosphere and its ambiance, especially because I actually had never seen Blade Runner until just a couple of months ago, when I started watching it in preparation for the game. It absolutely changed my perspective on some of the prep that I could be doing to enhance my own player's experience. Now, I'm not going to go to the exact same length for every single session, but I've always kind of romanticized like the big bad evil guy, ultimate fights, right? When I go to run Castle Ravenloft and now it's time for the players to sink or swim, those are the moments where, I do want to pull it out when it's time to really interact with the main conflict of the story. But to be able to see how much that actually added to the experience was really cool. And after everybody left, I turned everything back on and just kind of hung out in the room and chilled for a couple of hours, because it did tickle a certain part of my brain that I had never experienced before in the context of a tabletop game. So the next question that I have for you is, has there been a tabletop experience that you've had that was really, really memorable or phenomenal that stood out to you because of some of the extra preparation that the GM or the players brought to the game?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Tell me about it.
So the one that stands out to me, so we've been playing it. We were playing Iron Kingdoms. It wasn't D&D, but it was Iron Kingdoms. We've been playing for several months now. We came up to this titanic, massive battle.
Mhm.
And we're like, all right, this is going to be really cool. And, you know, our GM was the brother of a very well-known writer in the area. So we played in his basement, and we were asked to show up there. And when we showed up, our GM, his brother, had built this massive city. And our whole session, this was the end. This was the massive Titanic battle. Everything before that, again, playmat, dry erase markers, nothing huge. And now we had this massive city, and it wasn't all one level. It had tier. There were hills, there were houses on top of those hills, there were elevated levels that had structures on it. In the middle of this city was this massive bell tower, and we had those walls surrounding that, and there was, landscape outside of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then he had invited another well-known author in the area to come over and play the army. Well, and the reason he was invited is because he already had all the figurines and all the stuff for that army, because that's what he does. And so our job was to defend the city from this invading army. We had other armies, our own armies or contingents or whatever, to hold back the horde. And it was amazing to have those structures. Don't get me wrong. When you have that extra stuff, it does definitely level up your game.
Mm-hmm.
But we could have still done it without it.
Mm.
But it did make it so much more. Like you said, we had background music playing. We had these massive armies flooding in, and he was controlling them like he was the general. And we're just trying to get through and survive the day. I didn't think we were going to live, I'll be honest, but we did. We made some amazing choices. We made some great choices, and pulled off some really tricky maneuvers I didn't think we were going to be able to do. And we ended up winning the day. Even the guy that was controlling the evil army was impressed, and he thought he had it in the bag, because before he even we had him go away.
Mm-hmm.
And before he even got to start bringing in stuff, our GM gave us 20 minutes to devise a battle plan, knowing this army was coming in. We didn't know what direction. And then after we were done, we left, and he, not knowing what we were planning, he got to determine how he was going to attack the city. Mm-hmm. So it was really cool. And then we came in and we started, and it was an amazing experience. Don't get me wrong. But I still think we could, like I said, I still think we could have done it without that.
Mm-hmm.
But it did level it up. It did make it epic. It did make it enjoyable. There was music playing. There was one point where the evil general unleashed this one contingent, and they were led by these brutish creatures that were playing drums. And on cue, boom, the GM plays the war drums, and you're hearing those pounding. It really gets your heart racing. It gets feel like you're living it. You're in that movement. When you have aspects like that, when the lighting is right, when the soundtrack plays, when you have sound effects, and they broke through the walls at one point, and then the GM at that point was all you heard in the background was the sound of swords and weapons clashing, and now it's real. They're inside the walls. Now what do we do? So those things do affect gameplay. They do level up the experience. If you have the opportunity, yes, but it's really hard to have every game session.
Yeah. And that's about where I've landed too. is basically I put my sessions into one of three categories, and that's going to determine the level of show that I'm going to bring to it, right? So basically, you've got your minutia, where we're not, even though we're always progressing the story, we're not necessarily dealing with something super, super deep and serious that week. Then you've got your mini bosses, which is like your middle level. And this isn't always necessarily a battle, but it is, I want to make sure that my players know, like, this is a session where critical decisions are being made, where the path is diverting and you've got to know which path to go. And then I've got like my super boss battles, where this is going to represent oftentimes the beginning of the campaign, the end of the campaign, and if there is a major climactic moment that has to happen somewhere in the middle, that's where I'm a lot more willing to go all out. What I have found too is that within each of those categories, I'm going to scale it up or down slightly based on the players at the table. For the Curse of Strahd campaign that I'm running right now is a great example. I have two players who are very, very battle focused. They will engage in a little bit of role play, but that's really not where they have a lot of fun. And so I learned that in order to help them have a good time, which is, again, the golden rule of storytelling, I print maps ahead of time. I go down to my local print shop and I make sure to get, big blueprint paper so that it's all done and ready to go. It adds a little bit of time for me. Sometimes it means that I don't get as much flexibility to be able to alter a dungeon on the fly as I would like. But for those players, it is a huge difference for them to be able to actually see what's on the table and have that next layer of information up. The other one that's important to me with every session is music. I have a number of playlists that I've put together for different types of encounters and things like that. And similarly, as I go up to that middle tier or up to that top tier, I'm probably going to curate music specifically for that experience. Some of it is going to be excerpts from the playlists that I already have, but I try to think about what the emotional and energetic flow of the night is going to be and plan out my playlist around that, because it allows me to punctuate some of the emotional moments with the background music itself. And for those nights, I have some RGB LED floodlights that I'll put up too, just to add a little bit of extra light. And then we've got our big boss battles. Now, I'll be honest, I still have yet to do one of these at the size, scale, and scope that I would really love to do it, which is much more akin to what this friend of mine does, where he really pulls out all the stops. Part of that, simply put, is because the majority of the work that I've done as a GM has required me to be very mobile. I'm not bringing crates and crates and crates of miniatures and all kinds of things. And so I've never really taken the time to build it. And as I've purchased products like that, the majority of them have ended up being used in my game stores, which is perfectly fine. But being able to make sure that the story moments that matter most get that little bit of extra sauce is something that I feel adds a lot to the player's experience, but it also adds to my experience as the GM, because it puts me into the mood and into the mindset of how the session is going to go. So the other curiosity that I have for you, Dan, is when I am getting ready for some of these sessions, very similarly, there's different degrees of preparation that I will put into it beyond just what's at the table, but literally how much time am I spending ahead of time putting myself into the game, putting myself into the story. And you've had some experience as a GM, at least I assume. It's a gentle tease.
I mean, let's see, 36 years now? Yeah.
Yep. And a question that I get a lot from newer GMs in particular is, how much time should I spend prepping for each session? So I kind of want to open that up to you. What do you think, or what is your general standard when you're preparing for a session versus a large campaign?
I mean, in the past, when I first started out, it was rather lengthy. I would build entire But like an adventure, I would have an entire 3-ring binder full of every possibility, every interaction, which way it could go, so that it was kind of like a choose your own adventure. If we hit a point and it's like, okay, if they go this or that, this is where I go in it. It was rather really extensive, which is why, I was running a game at a convention and someone sat down and said, if you ever wrote a book, I would publish you, because they read how detailed it was. After that, I kind of pulled back. I pulled back to more on the fly, because there was a couple other convention games that I ran. I was at Salt Lake Fan X, and I had a bunch of friends that came up and said, "Hey, my buddy has never played a role-playing game. Could you run one tonight?" And I'm like, "Sure." Like, the only thing I have on hand is, the Firefly role-playing game. Like, yeah, let's do it.
Cool.
And I just, it was all improv, on my toes, winging it. And it was a great game. And I'm like, wow, this went really well. And I had nothing prepared for it. I just had an idea, and I just kept building on that. Now, so it kind of depends. It's kind of like how you do with the levels. If it's just, someone just wants to play real quick for an encounter, it's just, I have the idea, we go from there. Let that, because it's just really the fight. They get through that, we're done. If it's if it's a group that, man, they just want to just charge through a dungeon, I have a basic outline. That's all we do. They need to dive into the dungeon to collect something or rescue someone. We're good. And then from that, if they want somewhere in between, a full dungeon crawl and some light to mid role playing, then once the role playing aspect comes in, that's where I start putting a little bit more attention in. And I have plot points. So, for example, I've been running a game with some friends, and I put about an hour's worth of time in for last night's adventure. It was kind of one of those transition moments where they just finished off one of the baddies, and we're kind of transitioning into, okay, now that we've discovered these things, where are we going to go next? So I knew there wasn't going to be a lot, but the week before that we played, I probably put in a good 4 or 5 hours, building how I wanted that to run, the dialogue I wanted to write, because and express, because let's face it, not every dialogue comes out, but I needed to have that in case they asked a question or in case they did something. And so and that dialogue is probably where I spend the most time, because key things can come out in that. And I want it to come out a certain way with a certain tone or a certain flavor. So there's some times where I'll write something like, oh, I didn't really like that. And then I'll come back to it and tweak it. Or maybe I'll get another idea during the week. I'm like, oh, that's so much better than I had for this. And then I'll tweak it. So I probably, and we play for 3.5, almost 4 hours. So I'd probably put in about the same amount of time prepping for it as we do playing, with the exception of, when it's kind of a transition week where I know not a lot's going to happen.
See, and it's interesting, because I'm kind of the same, but where I tend to put a lot of my focus and prep is around themes, motivations, and objectives of the actual characters and factions within the world that we're playing in. It's one of the reasons that I love Curse of Strahd so much, is because a lot of people correctly describe it as a sandbox, but it's also a toolbox.
Yeah,
there are dozens of named characters who each have their own interesting backstories and things that they can do. I rarely will incorporate every single NPC in the book within the campaign itself, but I know what all of their motivations are, and I know how they would interact in the larger world, so that as my players send me the signals of what they are interested in pursuing, I can bring in the appropriate people to kind of make that happen. Similarly, that's the same way that I approach my encounters and objectives within the game, because I hate to railroad. I hate to force people down a specific path, but in order to have a cohesive story, you do have to have a structure. Things have to happen in a particular way in order to get to a satisfying ending. And so rather than contriving how to get my players to go somewhere, instead, I'm thinking about like, what are the foundational things that have to be in place for that encounter to make sense, for that interaction with an NPC to make sense. And as my players build a critical mass of those things, now I'm just pulling out the appropriate encounter to slot into that part of the story, right?
Yeah.
So that then it doesn't actually, I don't have to tie everything to an actual geographical location on a map, as long as it makes sense in the context of what the players are doing. Does that make sense?
No, it does. It's very similar to what I do. I don't, you have objectives. You have, as you put it, objectives. What was the other one?
Objectives, motivations, and themes.
Motivations and themes. So very similar, but I just call it story. I have multiple storylines running in my head. One is the player and their character. What has the player and their character established? What is their backstory? What is the story they've created since we started? And what pieces or threads of that story can I start pulling into the main storyline? The main storyline has its own thread. And then we have the side quests. Those are each threads. How do I pull and weave those in? And the villain, the mini bosses, each of them have their own story and thread. How do I weave those in? So that's, it's very similar, but I call it something different, and as we're weaving this tapestry, we're pulling each of these threads. The players are tweaking their own story collaboratively, working with me. Sometimes we have this beautiful picture. Sometimes we have this beautiful picture and this weird little, instead of fighting a massive red dragon, we have a Snoopy down there because someone did something weird. But it's still a tapestry at the end. And, one of my players the other week we were playing, he just looked at me, he goes, how are you keeping all these storylines together? Like, I'm barely keeping mine and a couple of these guys at the table. How are you doing it? Let alone you're constantly weaving this story that I'm just like getting pulled further and further and further into. And it's just how my brain works. And I think DMs or GMs have that gift of story and being able to manipulate all these things, whether it's, intentions and objectives and stuff like that, or threads, like I call them, together. And then at the end of the day, there's this beautiful story or tapestry or whatever you want to call it that is created. And the fun thing about it is no matter if it goes horribly wrong or amazingly well, most often, everyone at the game table has had a great and enjoyable time. Even the entire party's been killed, because of some dumb mistake. They just look and be like, wow, did that really happen? Most GMs won't allow that to happen, for one. There'll be some act of God, some dungeon master escape route, but there's always some amazing thing or story that comes out that people will tell for years. As I'm thinking, here, and we're talking about game setting and stuff like that, I remember I was invited to a session of Ravenloft. It was years ago, where Tracy Hickman was running that game, and you were sitting in, and a couple other people. We didn't have a lot of those components, but what we did have was a great storyteller. We had that story of the mind going, and it was great and fantastic and amazing. And I know Tracy is working on some gigantic castle Ravenlofted, so that it's 3D printing out and you can go through that. It would be interesting to go back through that with him, with that castle this time, because a lot of it was in our head. Now we can physically see it. It would be interesting and fun to participate in that, but it's not needed, because like you said, you have the ambience, the setting, the lights dim. You change your voice to be deep and foreboding, and you hear the sound of bats in the background or the baying of a wolf as you're giving the narration. Now they're already in that land in their head. Doesn't matter what else happens, they're there. And that unfolds. That movie in your mind unfolds. I mean, there's a reason, in my opinion, that graphic audio, the audiobook series, is so successful because of that. They add that ambiance. They add those additional sounds. They have a voice for every character, and it draws you in further and further until finally you find yourself like so hooked you don't want to stop. Yeah.
And I'm glad that you mentioned a few different things there, and this is how I think I want to wrap up today, which is, first, Dungeon Crawler, if you're listening to all of this and you're like really worried about, well, how do I spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on putting all this together? You don't have to. This is one more tool in your quiver. And if you have the financial and time capability to be able to do it, it is a really fun thing that can add a lot to the experience. But it isn't a requirement. And if you are taking the time to be well read, to understand the structure of story, to understand how characters develop, and to understand the psychology of play, to help people at the table have a good time and look for those story moments collaboratively with the other players that are there, you will be able to go an exceptional distance without worrying about all of the accoutrement and all the set dressing.
Yeah.
So absolutely lean in and just have a wonderful time with it. Now, in terms of Tracy and the 3D Ravenloft Castle, this is in fact one of the reasons that this has been on my mind, because I have the opportunity in January. We're going to be going on a cruise as part of the Critical Hit Soda Kickstarter that ended earlier this year, and we're bringing a whole bunch of people out to play some brand new content in Castle Ravenloft. I'm really excited to see how having some of those accoutrements in place is going to amplify that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the kind of thing that you or anybody else is interested in doing, let them know. Let Tracy know, because we're kind of testing this to see whether it's something, first off, that is fun and enjoyable for Tracy and Laura. I want to make sure that we are being very respectful to their time and energy, but also to see what works. And if it works and they have a good time, they may be willing to consider something more. I'm not going to hold their feet to the fire on that, because ultimately they get to be at choice. And until we see how this first one works out, who knows? But I'm curious how many of you dungeon crawlers would be interested in maybe joining us to do an adventure like that. And if so, what are some of the accoutrements that you would like to see? What are some of the things, if you're going to have a once-in-a-lifetime gaming experience, what would you want to have at the table? Let us know in the comments. Send us an email at dungeoncrawlersradio@gmail.com. And as always, share the show. We look forward to seeing you again next week. But with that, I'll hand it back to you, Dan. Anything else you want to wrap out with?
No, honestly, this has been great discussion. Again, the great thing about D&D is you could run this game with literally nothing than a character sheet, a pencil, and a set of dice. You don't need anything more than that. That was the beauty of this game, is you could get together with any of your friends anywhere and run it with just the bare minimum. If you have the extra stuff, it just ups the game. It makes it more amazing and spectacular, so you don't have to spend as much time visualizing it, but it's not a requirement. So if you have any questions, we definitely love to hear from you. Tell us about how you run your game. What are the things that you need, the things that you really want to be able to sit at the game table? What are some of your greatest experiences, and so forth? But with that said, we'll catch you next time.
And Dungeon Crawler, tell your story, whatever may come. And always remember to be epic and don't suck.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find us.
Remember, the Force will be with you, always.
What happens when modern magic, high-tech weaponry, and an unstoppable dragon collide? Find out in the epic audiobook of A Dragon's Fate, brought to life by Daniel and Krebs. This Whitney Award finalist novel will pull you into a pulse-pounding world where a secret cabal battles for power, and a dragon could bring everything to an explosive end. Don't just hear the story. Feel the magic, the danger, and the action. Get ready for a ride you won't forget. Grab your copy of A Dragon's Fate, now available on Audible.